The sky is open. The earth is open. The west is open. The east is open. The south half of the sky opens. The north half of the sky opens. The doors are wide open. The deadbolts are unlocked. And it is here that Ra appears in the horizon. This litany allowed the already purified deceased to accompany Ra in his solar barge as he traveled the firmament in search of the sun god. It belongs to the most popular of the sacred texts of ancient Egypt, the Peri-Em-Hu, the Book of Coming Forth by Day, more famously known as the Book of the Dead. Those texts were written 1,500 years before Christ, at the beginning of what was called the New Empire, a time when ancient Egypt reached its maximum splendor. But in fact, they originated from older texts. The Book of the Dead is a recompilation of several funerary writings that the ancient Egyptians had already started to carve in tombs and temples 5,000 years ago. The first testimonials of Ra, the sun god, started to emerge at that time. But other more diffuse ones were also present. The debate must have started in trying to discover where Ra was in the hours of darkness. The ancient Egyptians deducted that a place should exist under the firmament where the sun could regenerate itself and thus be able to re-emerge in a new dawn. They called it the underworld. It was home not only to the gods and the deceased worthy of eternal life, but also to the forces of evil and darkness. It's the eternal struggle between good and evil, light and darkness, life and death. Opposing principles that cannot exist one without the other. Maintaining the balance between the underworld and the real world was the main concern of the ancient Egyptians. A disruption of that harmony would destroy their existence and subsequently their greatest ambition, eternity. For the ancient Egyptians, the Nile was the main connection between their lives and an infinite supply of provisions. The progress and well-being they achieved thanks to that fountain of life allowed for the creation of one of the most extraordinary civilizations that ever existed. But its waters hid an underworld of darkness and mystery for its first settlers. The Nile was one of the spiritual paths that combined life and death, the real world and the underworld.
We can go back about to 20,000 years ago, when the Egyptians were very few. They came from the south and the north and created the community of Egyptians. And they saw that the Nile flood every day, every year in one date. And the sun rises every day in the sky. They tied or make relationship between the sun comes every day, the Nile goes in one line with something called everlasting or eternity or life forever.
Unlike most civilizations, for the Egyptians, the color black was not associated with either mourning or sadness. Instead, it symbolized the power of regeneration. For them, it was a miracle that year after year, the Nile's black mud fertilized their lands, following its annual floods.
When those floods occur, they leave behind a fertile land called the Kemet. In fact, Kemet was the name given to Egypt by the ancient Egyptians. It's a very fertile land in which the Egyptians could farm their crops and live in. Even today, 90% of Egypt's population lives around the Nile, which is the provider of those crops.
They didn't limit their observation to the sacred river. They noticed that every year before the floods, a star would appear in the firmament.
They studied the stars exhaustively. The beginning of the Egyptian year coincides with the reappearance of a particular star called Sirius, following a long period of invisibility. That event in mid-July occurs at the same time as the flooding of the Nile, whose waters give life to Egypt. The appearance of the star symbolizes the celebration of the new year.
That was a key factor for the development of Egyptian culture. Knowing when the floods occurred allowed them to determine the right time to sow. That and the great projects of water channeling turned their lands into the most fertile lands on the planet. The main application of that knowledge was the development of the first and most perfect calendar ever made in ancient times, and which is still the basis for the one we handle today. For the ancient Egyptians, the first day of the year was the day Sirius appeared in the firmament. A year divided in 12 months of 30 days each. In order for everything to match up, 5 days were added at the end of the year, the days of Anubis, the jackal-headed god. The year had 3 seasons of 4 months each: flood season, sowing season, and harvesting season.